Hello everyone, this is Jotto, and welcome to the Managrind tournament recap on April Fool's Day. Just had to be a Tuesday this year, didn't it? Just had to be a Tuesday. No, I'm not doing an April Fool's thing. Way too many people do those. I'm just going to move on with the normal tournament recap, and happy April Fool's Day everyone. But let's get started, shall we? On to the top four from NA, we had in first place Tate, in second place Dreadmaker, and tied for third we had JMES and DJ Big Russ. On to Tate, who's playing Warrior Legendaries. This is one of the first times Warrior Legendaries has actually won one of the Opens. Also one of the first time two have shown up. Mostly it's one and they don't tend to win, so it was kind of weird to see two of them show up and also them win one of them. Onto the actual deck, starting with the Enrage engine. We have Armor Smith for defense early, along with the Wild Pyromancer in this case, which is an interesting tech card. We then have Acolyte of Pain to draw in some of your cards, and Frothing Berserker to give them a threat they have to deal with early. Then we have Cruel Taskmaster to enable all of your Enrages if your opponent doesn't feel like it. On top of this though, for the early game, we do have a Chillwind Deity and two Senjins, which is kind of a weird addition. Senjins are designed to stop aggro. Chillwind Deity, I think, is designed to mess up priests. The priest cost has become a little bit more popular recently. You see them a lot around after the Fight Night thing. So it is kind of interesting that the Chillwind's in there. It's really annoying for a priest to deal with a Chillwind. So I think that card just became better overall. Now, as for the actual Legendary Suite, it's only playing 3. And the standard ones aren't here. We have Alexstrasza along with the Gorehowl. That's pretty standard. We then have Ragnaros. But no Grom. There's no Grom, there's no Ysera. We have a Baron Geddon instead, which is very interesting. And I think the point of this one is just to be sort of less of a win condition, more of a you have to deal with this because it will eventually kill you, but mostly it's just a board wipe. It's really odd. It also damages your own stuff, which enables some of your Enrage. I do like it as a tech card. Not quite sure how good it is, but based on the fact that this won the tournament, I'm guessing that it did a large amount of work. By the end of this, it did pretty well in the actual tournament, so I'm very curious to see whether Baron Geddon shows up in more of these decks. As to the actual spells, we have Singular Brawl to deal with big board states, particularly from aggro decks. Shield Slams along with Shield Block, standard single target combo that deals a lot of damage and cantrips. We then have Slam for draw power. Cleave, another interesting addition here. Again, a little bit of extra AoE along the Wild Pyros and Baron Geddon and such. We then have 2 Whirlwinds, AoE that enrages your own stuff, 2 Executes, generate off your Cool Taskmasters, your Whirlwinds for example. And then for the weapons, we already said the Gorehowl used for the OTK combo, and then we have Fiery War Axe. Early defense against aggro decks. It's kind of like the Stormforged Axe from Warrior. On to Dreadmaker playing a rogue aggro deck. Now, it's kind of this is a really weird deck. I'm not gonna lie. This is one of the strangest decks I have seen in a very long time. So, let's get started with it, shall we? We have Blood Mage Thanos Leroy, pretty standard for rogue decks in general. It gives you some burst, gives you some reach. Now, 2 Azure Drakes, 2 SI7s, again standard. Draw 2 for 1s on sticks, essentially. Azure Drake also gives you some extra spell damage. Then have Loot Hoarder, Bloodsail Raider, Abusive Sergeant. 6 minions that are very aggressive in this deck. Just kind of odd. And I was thinking, wait a second here, but then you have Senjin. It's kind of like an early aggro mid-range thing. Senjin again to stop aggro, give you the edge in that. But the Bloodsail Raiders and Abusive Sergeants get a huge amount of early pressure, and Loot Hoarder really cycles through all your stuff. I almost called this cantrip, but it's only 5. It's not really running the full element of it. It's kind of like an aggro cantrip mid-range thing. It was kind of weird. And then we have the spells. We have 2 Blade Flurry, along with the 2 Deadly Poison, and in this deck there's also 2 Perdition's Blade and Assassin's Blade to benefit massively from this kind of boost. Now 2 Eviscerate, standard. Shadow Step, since you have so many battle cries you can abuse, or things with charge. A Sprint, very interesting tech card here, just to draw some cards in the late game, since you're probably going to need it if you're burning through your hand this quickly. Assassinate to get up with big taunts. 2 Backstabs, free removal. Deadly Poison, as I said earlier, to deal with sort of bump up that Blade Flurry damage to huge levels, and Sap to get over things like Ancient of War and just anything that's a huge tempo loss for them. For the weapons, the Assassin's Blade mostly uses continuous damage, along with the Deadly Poison. It's 20 damage in total. Perdition's Blade, more of sort of an early SI7 on a weapon. That's, I think, the best way of saying it. It's an SI7 on a weapon, you get an SI7 trigger, and then you get 2 more on successive turns. So it's a very, very interesting card. I do think that SI7 is slightly better than Perdition's Blade, but I would definitely think about playing both. Very, very interesting deck. On to JMES, playing a Hunter Beast midrange. Now, this is kind of like the one from last week, but also kind of different. So, what is different in this particular one? First of all, starting off with the minions, we have a King Mukla. One of the weirdest additions I've seen and constructed in a while. There's a lot of those coming out recently. King Mukla is in fact a beast. He's a 5/5 beast, and that's why he's in the deck. His downside is pretty hefty later on in the game, but if you get him early, he's a huge powerhouse, and you get a Houndmaster on him, you get a 7/7 with Taunt that turns on your kill commands. Now, the weird thing is, kill command is normally the reason you play beasts. Alright, let me explain here. The tribal from Beast is generally used for a couple of things. Scavenging Hyena, Starving Buzzard, Stampeding Kodo, Kill Command, and Timberwolf, and Houndmaster. If you actually look at the deck, we've got no kill commands, which is very, very odd. We do have the Starving Buzzards, and we do have the Houndmasters, and 1 Kodo, but that's about it. Which begs the question, how powerful is sort of the tribal in this deck? I mean, you do have the Buzzards, which is a fairly big deal, but it is kind of weird to play beasts without kill commands. It's kind of weird. But anyway, moving on to the rest of the deck. So, King Mukla, in this case, normally he would turn on kill commands, but in this case he doesn't. He's just sort of an early thing for Starving Buzzard and Scavenging Hyena, also not in this deck, randomly, by the way. But he is sort of a boost for Starving Buzzard, and you can give him charge with Stampeding Kodo later on in the game. He's okay in this particular deck. I wouldn't play him in other decks, so to say, but I think in this kind of deck he's okay. Although it is kind of weird that there's sort of the sheer lack of tribal in this particular variant. Then we have Leroy Jenkins, again later on burst. We have an Imp Master, very, very interesting, along with 2 Knife Jugglers. Early support to the sort of early mid game. We do have 2 Savannah Highmanes with 1 Kodo, as opposed to 2 Kodo, 2 Highmane, which a lot of people have been playing recently. I think Highmane should stay as a 2-of. I do really, really like Highmane. I think it's one of the most powerful 6-drops in the game. Stampede and Kodo, interesting to have as a 1-of, as I said, but again, it's a little slow. Then we have Ironbeak Owl, Silence, that you can use your tribal effect on. Leper Gnome, very, very odd early aggro. Then we have 2 Stranglethorn Tiger, bringing down the beatdown with those 5/5s with Stealth, another interesting addition. Stranglethorn Tigers are very, very irritating to deal with, I must admit. They don't die to Flame Strike, and they don't die to pretty much anything else. I mean, Flame Strike is generally the peak. The only thing this will die to is 3 spell power on a Lightning Storm, basically. I mean, you can get away with 2, but guaranteed 3 spell power on a Lightning Storm, which is ridiculous. Basically, they will always live, and that is the interesting thing. They will always live through pretty much everything, and they will always get to attack, and that's why they're in the deck. We then have 1 of Bloodfen Raptor for that early aggro, and it's also a beast. 2 Houndmaster, buff up all of your small beasts, and 2 Starving Buzzards, your draw engine. Very, very odd set of minions in this particular deck, which I do like. I think Hunter Beasts, at least, is very, very unexplored, and this is sort of a weird variant of it, but it's did quite well, as you can tell. So, it's an odd minion sweep. I would definitely test it out. As for the actual spells, we have 2 deadly shots in this particular one, because you're going to be controlling the board a little bit more and deal with the big stuff, while your minions deal with the small stuff. We then have 4 traps, since you're playing 2 Eaglehorn Bows, the 2 best traps, arguably. Explosive and Freezing. No misdirections in this particular one. Explosive Trap is the compulsory AoE. Freezing Trap helps deal with big stuff. As the same with Deadly Shot. And for the actual weapons, the Eaglehorn Bow is just a continuous clock all the time. Especially with 4 traps in the deck, you can probably get 5-6 Eaglehorn Bow attacks in a game if you draw both of them. Then have 2 Animal Companions, the best 3-drop beasts in the game. And 2 Unleash the Hounds is sort of an additional AoE that synergizes with your Starving Buzzard to draw a bunch of cards. Lastly, we have a Gladiator's Longbow, which is a very, very underestimated weapon, which is mostly used to deal with things like Fire Elemental without taking any damage back. Then, lastly, for the NA, we have DJ Big Russ playing Druid Tokens, a deck we have not seen in a while. Now, Druid Tokens is very, very different to Druid Beatdown. Druid Tokens is a very, very fast deck. It's an aggro deck. And it doesn't really run sort of the late game power that the beatdown variant does. Now, onto the minions. We have Leroy Jenkins as the final finisher. Black Knight to get over some big stuff because you don't have access to that much removal as playing a Druid. But then I have 2 Ancient Allures, draw power. Zero Drake, draw power again. Also gives some spell power to your swipes and your Wraths. Nothing else, but that's pretty much what you expect from a Druid. We then have, onto the token engine, 2 Imp Masters, along with 2 Violet Teachers and 2 Harvest Golems. It's not much of a token engine, but it really is enough. It basically lets you litter the board with tokens all the time. Imp Master is better in the early game than with Harvest Golem as well, with efficient trading. Violet Teacher, I think, is a very, very underestimated card that should be played in a lot more decks than it is currently. And you can just go Violet Teacher, Innovate Wrath, kill their guy, get 2 1/1s and a 3/5. That is a very powerful turn 4 play. Very, very powerful turn 4. And if you have the coin as well, you get 3 1/1s. It's completely ridiculous. Lastly, we do have the Keeper of the Grove, best silence minion in the game, effectively, is also 2 damage when you need it. Druid of the Claw, best 5-drop in the game, arguably. 4/6 with Taunt is absolutely crazy, and sometimes it's just an Argent Commander eternally. Lastly, out of all the minions, Argent Squire, resilient, early pressure, buff it up with some of your other spells, very solid 1-drop. As to the actual spells, you do have the standard Force of Nature, along with Swipes and Wraths and Innervates. 2 Savage Rolls in this one, because you can actually exploit the second one with your deck. And 2 Power of the Wilds. You can actually, with Violet Teacher, go Power of the Wild, make a 1/1 that then gets buffed by the Power of the Wild, so you get 2/2. Very, very underestimated. It also makes 3/2s, which is an interesting interaction there. You can make 3/2s and make a 1/1. Generally, the 2/2 and the 4/6 off the Violet Teacher are slightly better, but you can make a 3/2 in a pinch. And the last card in the deck is something I do want to talk about, is the Claw. Now, Claw is a very, very controversial card as far as Druid players go. Some Druid players love the card because it deals things like Fairy Dragon for almost free. And some people hate it because you can't cycle it like you can with Wrath. I think in my case, I sort of fall on the Wrath side of things, where, I mean, you obviously play Wraths over Claws. But the fact that you can't cycle Claw to me is a little sketchy, although I do see the upsides to it. I would say that it's sort of your decision whether you want to play Claw or not. I'd personally go on the sort of the side of not. But then again, it is personal preference and really depends on what you have issues with in your games. Now, on to the top 3 from EU. We have in first place Airbrushed, in second place Shark, and in third place Maxi. We did not get the 4th deck from EU this week. First place, Druid Beatdown from Airbrush. Now, Druid Beatdown completely disappeared for a week, so everyone forgot about it. And it's back with a vengeance. So, there are 2 Druid Beatdown decks here. Well, kind of. One of them is the Watcher variant, but I'm just going to go over this one completely, and then the second one, I'm going to go over just the Watcher section of it. Now, for this particular variant of Druid Beatdown, there's a lot of one-offs. We have Blood Mage Thalnos for the spell damage. Then we have Cairn to hold down the early game. Cenarius and Ragnaros. That's a weird one. Normally you only see one of those. Hold down the late game, deal a bunch of burst damage later on. The Black Knight, again, you don't have Tinkermaster anymore. You need it in Druid. 2 Ancient of Lores, draw power. An Ancient of War to exploit the lack of Black Knight some people have nowadays. Very, very, very smart in this particular metagame. 1 Big Game Hunter, deal with all the Ragnaros. Faceless Manipulator, because you play Big Game Hunter, you probably want Faceless as well. Copy their Ragnaros, kill their Ragnaros. Essentially, you pay the same amount of mana, but then you get a Rag, a 4/2, and he loses his Rag. So it works. Then we have 1 Azure Drake. Again, a little bit more of the draw power and sort of a second outlet to the spell damage. 2 Keepers, best silence in the game. Druid of the Claw, 5-drop, holds down for your late game, which this deck is abundant with. Then we have 2 Senjins. Senjins are showing up a lot with Zoo being so popular. Harvest Golem, again, very, very good 3-drop. Very, very good against Zoo. And lastly, a Chowan Yeti to really put a thorn in the side of the priests. As for the spells, we do have the standard Wrath, Swipe, Innervate. We then have a Starfall, which is a very, very interesting sort of thing. The major thing with Starfall is it kills Fire Elemental. And you can also use it as a 2 damage AoE against some of the aggro decks. A little bit more resilient than Swipe, but less raw power on the actual card. Then have a Mark of the Wild. This is Managrind's tech card that was taken to Fight Night. It was in pretty much all the Druid decks and really showed everyone how good that card can be at times. You just buff up whatever you need to and keep smashing them in the face. Against a Druid, you put that on a Druid of the Claw, and now you have a 6/8 with Taunt. Good luck with that one. And lastly, we have a card that no one seems to have seen in months, which is Wild Growth. Now, Wild Growth was in the original Druid beatdown deck. And at the time, it was called Druid Ramp. And it completely disappeared because it was slow. But in this particular variant, if you look at what he's playing, he has Cenarius, Ragnaros, Ancient of War, Ancient of Lore, Black Knight, Faceless Manipulator, Karen. There's so many late game cards that playing those Wild Growths is a huge, huge tempo swing. And I really do think it's worth it. Not to mention if you have 10 mana, you just cycle them out. On to second place, Shark playing Druid Watchers. Now, one thing to say. This is a completely budget Druid Watchers deck. This is playing no legendaries whatsoever. But anyway, as I said, I'm only going to go over the differences as opposed to sort of the whole deck again. The spells, all pretty much standard, although one Innervate is a little weird. Although you can sort of see why, because if you draw two, it's kind of odd, but then you lose consistency in that regard. But as for the actual minions, we do have Ancient Watchers, along with 2 Defender of Arius, 2 Sunfury Protectors, and also the Keeper of the Groves. Really sets up your engine. You can get a lot of early defense against aggro decks, and you can even silence him with your Keepers to get a 4/5 attacking continuously. Then I have a Loot Hoarder, seeing a lot more play recently, so you can cycle them through early game. Ascension, seeing a lot more play recently, as I said, against early aggro decks. Then we have 2 Acidic Swampoos. Really messes with hunters and the fact that warriors and shamans are around. There's a lot of weapon classes now, even paladins. A lot of weapon classes now. Ooze has definitely gone up in value. We then have Chillwind Yeti, a second Chillwind Yeti, since you really want to deal with priests, and with Ancient Watchers, it's even more of a pain in the neck for priests. And lastly, for the changes, we have Sunwalker. It's basically a Chillwind Yeti with Divine Shield and Taunt. For 2 extra mana. It's a very, very powerful card at the moment. Very, very difficult for people to deal with. It won't brick wall people like it used to, but it's pretty close. Taunt has definitely become much more viable recently with Tinkmaster leaving the format and Nat Pagal leaving the format, so you can set up slow Taunt creatures as opposed to having to go for these big aggro plays to deal with that Nat Pagal. So I do think that the whole Taunt thing is getting better, and Sunwalker should see a little bit more play in the future. And lastly, we have in third place Maxi playing Warrior Legendaries, the second one. Another first. Okay, so this particular version is running a ridiculous amount of win conditions. Now, I've already been over most of this deck before, so I'm just going to go over the differences in the actual legendary minions, because that is where the major difference is here. We have the Black Knight, along with Cairn, helps a lot with the early game. We then have Ragnaros Alexstrasza. Instead of Baron Geddon, we have a Grommash Hellscream for a little bit of extra burst damage late game. Really support the Ragnaros, gives you a lot of reach with things like Whirlwind or Cruel Taskmaster. And lastly, we have a Ysera, which is continuous card advantage. I think Malygos and Ysera are pretty much on the same level right now in terms of sheer power, but this deck would use Ysera much, much more than it does Malygos. I do think Malygos is going to become fairly good at some point. It's a card that's sort of waiting to be broken. It's probably going to be a Shaman deck, but it's waiting to be broken, and I do think that Malygos and Ysera are roughly on the same power level, but as I said, in this particular deck, Malygos doesn't do much, whereas Ysera just draws you cards continuously, and you win the game through that. Anyway, thank you all for watching. If you like the content, please subscribe. If you have any feedback, put it in the comment section below. Thank you for watching. This has been Jotto. Happy April Fool's Day, everyone. Signing off.